I'm wondering if you have a feel for, at this point, the guys that we didn't see enough of, or maybe we did see enough of, but didn't necessarily perform, that maybe will, make out differently with a new defensive scheme. Well, let's just talk about Tyler Owens for a moment, because, they liked him enough as an athlete and as a special teamer and as an occasional player to sign him to a 3-year deal. It wasn't a big money deal, certainly. It was a rookie deal, but still, this guy's under contract. He's not making much money. I think about him. I think about Medrano. I think about some of the players on defense that haven't had as many opportunities that may all of a sudden be attractive to a new defensive coordinator like Durante Jones and the kind of defense he'll play. I'm wondering if you have a feel for, at this point, the guys that we didn't see enough of, or maybe we did see enough of, but didn't necessarily perform, that maybe will, make out differently with a new defensive scheme.
Yeah, for sure. And look, you mentioned that RAS score. I believe, you can double check that, I believe Washington's last two draft classes were the highest rated.
Yeah.
Which is, of course, that's – so when we've been talking about, hey, they've got to get younger, they've got to get more athletic, they've got to get faster. Well, they have clearly leaned into some of that over these last two drafts. Now, of course, this is where, it doesn't always apply. I had one prominent front office leader from another team tell me that over the years when I've made mistakes, it's typically been towards the athlete. Now, obviously, in the case of Tyler Owens, it's an undrafted free agent, a good find. I think he played a little bit more last year. I think in his case, and maybe a little bit with Jordan McGee as well, it's how do you harness the athleticism, combine it more with the mental game, like understanding the plays that are happening in front of you, where you need to be, and all that kind of stuff. Ben Sinnott was another guy that was on. You're talking about defense, sorry, but Ben Sinnott was another guy that was on this guy that got some votes, and he was one of those guys who kind of wanted voted for himself, because his definition was he played 6 sports at varsity in his last year of high school, which is again a definition of that. But in terms of the defense, Mikey Sanders still got up there. I think we still don't quite understand what his best fit is. Slaughter outside. McGee, we saw his speed really stood out because the defense was not particularly fast. But, is he ready to play, the Mike linebacker? If that's the way it shakes out, if Wagner doesn't come back, can he call the plays? Can he keep the speed while having to think more, right, about what he has to do to get everybody kind of set up? I think that is something to keep an eye on. And, you mentioned before, we're talking about the international pathway guy. I mean, look, it's hard to – the fact that he even was active for a game was more than we'd seen from the others who were in that spot. David Botta comes to mind. There's something there. Actually, I'll have a story out at some point, because I talked to him and one of the coaches about who this guy is. And, like I said, they were just kind of blown away by the athleticism. Does that mean he's ready to play? I think there's some hope there, but again, what are we talking about? It's one thing to even make the 53. It's another thing to be productive. And that's the thing. They've got to turn some of this athleticism on both sides of the ball into actual production. And that's where it's kind of been, stuck so far, stagnant so far.
So I was talking to Keim yesterday, and he brought up a player just that could be interesting in free agency to Washington because of Durante Jones. Eric Wilson played at Minnesota this year, actually played very well as, an inside linebacker. He's, a veteran player, 31, 32 years old. If they move on from Bobby Wagner, a veteran like Eric Wilson, who's not only, high IQ, but a good player and a great teammate. And I thought about, who'd Quinn bring in, Bobby Wagner? Who'd Ron Rivera bring in? Thomas Davis. I mean, Davis was older, but, having, in a for a defensive head coach, and we had back-to-back defensive head coaches, they brought in players that were familiar with the systems. And I know Joe Witt Jr. was coaching it, but it was Dan Quinn's system. Do you think there's a possibility that there's a free agent on Minnesota's roster that ends up being an early target for Washington and free agent like an Eric Wilson? I mean, Harrison Smith seemed to be ready to retire at the end of this year after a long career in Minnesota. And maybe the Vikings are going to move on from him. But I thought that the Eric Wilson, and he is an unrestricted free agent, was a real interesting name that he brought up.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing you do when they bring in somebody from the outside, you're like, okay, well, let's look at that roster and see who might come. The Vikings don't have a particularly robust free agent class, at least in terms of from the outside perspective. Like, they may have people that they need to keep, but not necessarily. You're like, ooh, that's a guy. But you would think that a couple of guys will probably come over, but and maybe Wilson is sort of the top of the food chain in that regard, a guy that did start basically all season. Obviously, if it is sort of staying with the Flores system, would have some familiarity with that, of course. And the Bobby Wagner aspect of it, like my thought all along was, depending on who they hire to replace Joe Witt, could go a long way towards whether Wagner is back, because Wagner, beyond the fact that he's going to be a Hall of Famer, all these things, really clearly a Dan Quinn guy, a Ken Norton Jr., the linebacker coach guy, and that's why it made sense to bring him in again on top of being, an all-timer. So why wouldn't the logic still apply for Durante Jones? Now, right when the Durante Jones announcement happened, I brought on a guy that covers the Vikings, Matthew Collar, who's also on Substack, and we had a live chat, and I asked about Harrison Smith, and he just kind of gave me a look like, he's either going to retire or he's not going to leave. Like, he's a Viking. I'm not saying he's Darryl Green, but he's kind of that for that organization. So
sure,
that would seem pretty unlikely for him to go. One thing was, but one reason I kind of asked about Smith was, in that conversation, it was the notion that the safeties play a big role in what Flores was looking to do. The ability to go, up and back line of scrimmage and back and play a lot of the different spots. And if you're blitzing and that safeties play a big role, which is why I was wondering about Harrison Smith, and it's also why I wonder about Caleb Downs in the draft. Again, if in fact he does place a little bit more emphasis on safety, maybe that is something to keep an eye on, both in terms of free agency or the draft. But I don't think there was anybody else obvious to me on the Vikings where you're like, oh, that's a guy. Like when they brought in Dorrance Armstrong, there were like 5 or 6 guys on Dallas' defense that I could have said that would make sense. I don't know that I see the same for the Vikings.
All right, we're going to finish up doing this. I'm going to just ask you, back or somewhere else in terms of their own free agents. And I'll start with Chris Paul. Back or somewhere else?
This is an understanding, of course. I'm just mostly having the educated guess here, right? Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Chris Paul.
I mean, we're not. I'm not going to hold you to it because you might change. I mean, we're going to do this again. But right now is the time to do it because we're now going to get busy here, I think, for the next couple of weeks.
I just don't want somebody putting it on Twitter and it goes viral because they're just stating something.
You worry way too much about Twitter. You got to stop. Seriously. It just is not that important.
Chris Paul, I'm going to say no. I do think they would want him back. I just wonder, does the market for a guy who basically was a starter this year at a position that offensive line is hard to find. The college kids are just not coming out with the, with the skills. And I just can see somebody maybe going, hey, we'll give you some good money in Washington, thinking, well, we have Brandon Coleman. We've already invested a lot on the line, and we just have other needs. So I'll say no, but I do think they would like him back.
All right, back or not, Chris Paul? No. Back or not, Marcus Mariota?
I would have said 99% no prior to Cliff Kingsbury finding a job. The fact that Kingsbury got a job where he's not the play caller, it's not his offense or nothing, I'm going to drop it to like 65 no, because Mariota.
So it's still no.
Still a no, because Mariota is still, one of the. This is not a great QB free agent class, and like if Kyler Murray gets released by Arizona, then maybe that pushes the odds down for a guy like Mariota. But if Kyler Murray doesn't get free agency, then Mariota becomes a guy that people might want either as the stopgap or a fill-in or what have you. So I'll still say no. But again, he would like to. He likes it here. They like him, but I think he'll want to play.
Back or no? Back or not? Yes or no on Dietrich Wise?
I'll say no again, just based on the age and the
injury.
The injury, and again, is he what they're looking for in this new system? If it is more of like a 3-4 base, again, they'll move guys around and may not look like that. But you already then have, if Payne is staying, Kinlaw, Newton, like they're gonna have to bring in edge guys. Like maybe if they're just using more of a 3-4 look, then that guy Wise would be the guy who kind of be the odd man out. So I'm gonna guess no.
Back or not, Deebo Samuel?
I will say no. I just, again, and I've talked about this a bunch. He, to me, the way he played, and look, he had a really great training camp, a hot start to the season. Deebo did what he could do. The offense fell apart around him, but he's just not a traditional outside receiver. We saw that when Terry got hurt. He couldn't fill in that role, and he's just more of a luxury type of player. This team needs staples, so to me, they should be spending money on receiver as more of a traditional outside guy who can make plays down the field. So I'll say no on Deebo, but we'll see what the marketplace looks like.
All right, two more, and then that's it. Bobby Wagner.
Well, I mean, we just sort of had the Eric Wilson conversation. I would kind of like to say yes, because I think Wagner's ability to blitz, as he showed last year, along with the tackling, might actually be a better fit for what we think Durante Jones could do. But I don't know. At Wagner's point in his career, does he want to go? Look, he put in 2 good years here. Does he want to go through what looks like a rebuildy kind of year? And is Jones want him? So again, I'll kind of say no, but it wouldn't. I could easily see him back if they decide, hey, let's just keep him. We know what this is, and we can figure out other ways to help the defense elsewhere.
All right. The last one is I think everybody's assuming no, but I'm curious if you think there's a chance at yes for Zach Ertz.
Well, I'm going to say no in terms of him being back here. Whether he plays or not, that's a little harder to say. But, he was one of those guys that came here because Cliff Kingsbury was the OC, and they had their connection from their time in Arizona. That obviously is not a factor. Now, granted, he was here with David Blau the last couple of years, and not to mention Dan Quinn. But, in the notion of getting younger and all that, I just think you got to move on. And also, he got hurt in week 14. So I don't know what this means for his recovery. They have to figure out more at tight end, whether they go with Sinnott more or not. So I'll say no on Zach Ertz.
All right. Thanks. Have a good weekend. Give yourself a break from social media this weekend. That's my advice for the upcoming weekend for you. I'll talk to you later.
See ya.
Ben Standig, everybody.